"You're under arrest, Grandpa." The young officer's voice broke the quiet morning air. Daniel Rigg didn't move, didn't argue. He simply stood there, calm and still, as the cuffs clicked around his wrists. His eyes stayed forward, steady and distant, like someone who had seen this kind of ending before. At the courthouse, people whispered when they saw him. A few laughed under their breath. One juror rolled her eyes. To most of them, he looked like another angry old man who had picked the wrong fight. No one there knew who he really was, not even the judge. The courthouse was smaller than most people expected. A two-story brick building tucked between an old library and a dentist's office in a quiet southern town. The kind of place where people still nodded at strangers, still trusted uniforms, and still believed trouble always came from outsiders. That morning, the parking lot was already half full before the sun cleared the roofline. Reporters set up cameras in the back rows, waiting for a headline that hadn't yet shown itself. The case was supposed to be simple, a small fight at a gas station. No one had been hurt, no blood, no gun, just an argument between a retired Marine and a young man who claimed the veteran had threatened him. It should have been nothing. But Daniel's silence made people uneasy. He didn't defend himself. He didn't explain. He just showed up to every hearing, alone, wearing the same plain shirt and faded jeans, with eyes that never seemed to blink long. The bailiffs didn't know why, but something about him made them tense. He wasn't loud or violent, just still, too still. Some people said he was unstable. Others said he was bitter. One local newspaper called him an angry veteran with a short fuse. No one had asked about his record. No one had looked beyond the surface. They just saw an old soldier who couldn't let go of the past. Daniel lived alone on the edge of a wooded lot outside town, in a small trailer with no internet, no mailbox, and no visitors. Every morning, he walked the same dirt path at dawn, back straight, steps precise, as if still marching to orders no one else could hear. The neighbors noticed but never spoke to him. Some thought he was strange. Others thought he was broken, but nobody thought he mattered. In court, his name was typed neatly on a piece of paper clipped to the prosecutor's file. Daniel Rigg, age 66, former U.S. Marine. That was all they knew, and for most, that was enough. His public defender, a young woman named Amanda Burke, had tried to talk to him several times, but he barely responded. No family listed, no witnesses, no one coming to help. He didn't even seem angry, just tired. When she looked at him, she saw a man who had already stopped expecting fairness from the world. The bailiff brought him in, cuffs tight. Daniel didn't resist. He sat quietly at the defense table, hands resting in front of him, staring straight ahead. Behind him, a few people whispered, "Isn't that the guy who yelled at some kid over a parking space?" "No, man. He threatened to shoot someone. PTSD, probably." The judge entered. Everyone stood. The trial began. Witnesses gave vague statements. A store clerk said Daniel had acted aggressive. A woman claimed she heard him say something about knowing how to kill. The alleged victim, a man in his 30s wearing a neck brace he didn't need, told the jury he was terrified. When asked exactly what Daniel said, he hesitated, then told the court, "He said he could end me from 800 yards without blinking." The room buzzed. A few jurors frowned. Daniel didn't flinch. The prosecutor delivered his closing with confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen, this man may have served once, but that was a long time ago. What we have today is someone living in the shadow of a uniform he no longer wears. Someone who believes his past gives him power to intimidate others. That's not heroism. That's dangerous." His words hung in the air. Some jurors nodded. Daniel just stared at the table. Amanda didn't object. There was nothing she could say without him speaking. The judge gave instructions. The jury filed out to deliberate. As Daniel was led away toward the holding room, cameras clicked and whispers followed. The trial had lasted less than a day. Most expected a guilty verdict within minutes. No one noticed the black SUV that had just stopped outside the courthouse. Inside sat a man in a dark uniform. 4 silver stars gleamed on his collar. His eyes weren't on the cameras or the reporters. They were on the name printed on the docket inside, Daniel Rigg. The deliberation room door closed with a hollow click. The jury had been gone for less than 3 minutes. But to Daniel, time didn't move at all. He sat still at the defense table, hands resting flat, the chain from his cuffs hanging loosely against his belt. The air in the courtroom felt heavy, filled with quiet judgment. Across the room, the prosecutor scrolled through his phone with a small smirk. He knew this case was practically over. Amanda, the public defender, pretended to review her notes, though she'd already written everything she could. She glanced at Daniel once, wanting to say something, but his blank stare stopped her. He wasn't angry or scared, just distant, like his mind was somewhere far from this small courtroom. Outside, the hallway was beginning to buzz. Someone had snapped a photo of Daniel being led inside, and now it was circulating online. Local news reporters were setting up just beyond the doors, practicing their lines for the evening broadcast. A retired Marine charged for threatening a civilian. Trial concludes today. It sounded simple enough to them. No one realized the weight of the name they were saying. In the parking lot, a few old veterans stood quietly by their cars. They hadn't seen Daniel in years, but they'd all received the same message that morning. A short text passed through old military group chats. "They've got Rig on trial. Doesn't feel right." None of them were called to testify. None of them were even sure what had happened. They just came because something about it felt wrong. And then the black SUV pulled up. No sirens, no escort, no noise. The door opened, and a tall man in a crisp uniform stepped out. His silver hair was neatly trimmed, and 4 stars shone on his shoulders. He wasn't there for show. His eyes were sharp and focused, carrying the weight of someone used to command. General Samuel Wyatt, retired Chief of Special Operations Command. Most civilians wouldn't have recognized him, but the moment he walked through the courthouse doors, the clerk behind the reception desk stood a little straighter. The security officer at the metal detector didn't even ask for ID. The general just nodded once and said, "Courtroom 3. His voice carried quiet authority, the kind that didn't need volume to be heard. He walked through the hallway lined with reporters. Cameras turned. Someone asked if he was there as part of the press. Wyatt didn't answer. Another whispered, "That's General Wyatt, isn't it?" Phones came out. Pictures started flashing, but he didn't slow down. He stopped outside the courtroom doors, took a deep breath, and looked at the name on the schedule taped to the wall. State versus Daniel Rig. For a long moment, he didn't move. His eyes softened. The expression that followed wasn't anger. It was respect, maybe even guilt. Then he pushed open the doors. Inside, the sound of hinges made heads turn. The judge looked up, confused at first. Then she saw the stars on his collar and immediately rose from her seat. The entire courtroom froze. Even the prosecutor stopped mid-scroll. The general didn't walk to the judge. He didn't walk to the prosecution. He went straight to the defense table, straight to Daniel Rig. Daniel finally lifted his head. Their eyes met for the first time in over 30 years. No words, no handshake, just silence that said more than any greeting could. For a moment, everything else faded. The whispers, the cameras, even the ticking clock. The air shifted. The judge cleared her throat gently. "General, may I ask what brings you here today?" Wyatt didn't answer right away. He looked at Daniel again, then turned to face the courtroom. His voice was calm but filled with purpose. "I'm here because this man sitting before you is the reason I'm alive." Every camera in the room pointed toward him. The reporters leaned forward. The prosecutor blinked, confused. "He doesn't know I came today," Wyatt continued. "He didn't ask me to. In fact, he probably hoped I wouldn't. But I heard about this trial, and I couldn't stay silent." He took a few steps closer to the bench. 31 years ago, I was pinned behind a crumbling wall outside Fallujah. My unit was scattered. We had 2 wounded and no extraction. We were surrounded. And then, someone started firing. The room fell silent. Even the bailiff stopped moving. Every shot landed. 12 kills in under 5 minutes. The last one through a rooftop hatch at 900 yards, moving target, crosswind. That single shot saved my life. Wyatt turned his gaze toward Daniel. That sniper was Gunnery Sergeant Daniel Rig. The words hung heavy in the air. Reporters whispered. A juror gasped. The judge looked down, stunned. Wyatt raised his hand slightly, silencing the murmurs. "I've read the testimony. I've seen the charges. And I can tell you now, whatever words this man might have said, whatever was claimed, He's not a threat. If you knew what restraint looks like, you'd understand what real control means. And this man, more than anyone here, understands it. He turned back toward the judge. With your permission, Your Honor, I'd like to speak to the jury. The judge, visibly shaken, hesitated, then nodded slowly. Proceed, General. Wyatt stepped forward toward the jury box, standing tall. You all think he's quiet because he's guilty. He's not. He's quiet because he's tired. Tired of being misunderstood. Tired of watching people fear what they don't understand. But I'll tell you this. When chaos breaks loose, when no one knows what to do, you pray that a man like Daniel Rigg is nearby. He paused, his eyes scanning the faces before him. You don't put men like this in chains, he said softly. You put them in history books. No one moved. The room stayed frozen in the stillness that followed the general's words. The judge's hand hovered above her gavel, her eyes wide. The prosecutor's jaw tightened, trying to hold his composure, but his confidence was gone. The jury, half returned from deliberation, now stood in the doorway, unsure whether they should sit or run. Wyatt stepped away from the jury box and turned toward Daniel once more. His boots clicked softly against the wood floor, each step measured, deliberate. When he stopped in front of the defense table, it felt as if the whole room held its breath. He looked down at the man who once saved his life. Daniel didn't look up right away. His gaze stayed fixed on the tabletop, eyes tired but steady, hands folded calmly in front of him. His cuffs had been removed earlier, yet the heavy chain still hung from his belt like a quiet insult. Do you remember Fallujah? Wyatt asked softly. Daniel's voice was low but clear. I remember everything, sir. That was all he said. 3 words, but they carried a lifetime behind them. Wyatt nodded slowly. You always did. He turned back to the courtroom, scanning the faces that stared at him in confusion and disbelief. You see, the difference between a man like Sergeant Rigg and most people is that he doesn't need to explain himself. He's already done more for this country than anyone in this room could repay. He looked toward the prosecutor. You said he lives in the shadow of a uniform he no longer wears, but that's not a shadow. That's honor. That's memory. That's what keeps him walking when the rest of us forget what it costs to serve. The prosecutor opened his mouth to respond but stopped. There was nothing he could say that wouldn't sound hollow. Wyatt's voice softened. Do you have any idea what happens to a soldier when the war ends, but the memories don't? When people stop seeing a hero and start seeing a problem, you think silence means guilt. But for him, silence is survival. He turned to Daniel again. You didn't defend yourself because you've spent your whole life defending everyone else. For a moment, neither spoke. The tension in the air felt alive, like something invisible connecting them both. Then quietly, Wyatt did something no one in that courtroom expected. He dropped to one knee. The sound of it, the thud of his knee hitting the wooden floor, echoed through the silent room. Cameras flashed. Gasps filled the air. One reporter nearly dropped her phone. The judge's voice trembled. General, what are you doing? Wyatt didn't look at her. His eyes stayed on Daniel. I'm not kneeling to a soldier, he said firmly. I'm kneeling to the man who carried a burden no one else could. I'm kneeling because this system forgot what men like him gave up, so the rest of us could sit here and judge them. No one moved. The bailiffs froze. Even the young victim, sitting near the back, looked pale and ashamed. Daniel stared at the general for a long moment, his face unreadable. He didn't look proud. He didn't even look relieved. He just looked tired. But something in his eyes softened. He slowly stood up, the chain on his belt clinking quietly. He walked around the table, every step echoing in the still courtroom. When he reached Wyatt, he extended his hand. The general rose and took it firmly, the sound of their handshake sharp and real. 2 men, one in uniform, one in worn-out jeans, stood face to face, not as superior and subordinate, not as defendant and witness, but as brothers. The judge swallowed hard, emotion breaking through her usual calm. General Wyatt, she said softly, your words and your presence carry extraordinary weight. The court will take them under consideration. Wyatt shook his head. No, ma'am. Don't consider them. Understand them. She stared at him for a moment, then slowly nodded. The jury looked shaken, eyes glistening. One woman wiped a tear. Another man bowed his head. The prosecutor, realizing the tide had turned completely, sat down silently. His earlier smugness had vanished. Amanda, the defense attorney, blinked in disbelief. She had never seen anything like this. She'd handled hundreds of cases, but nothing like the moment unfolding before her, where truth didn't come from arguments or evidence, but from simple human respect. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice steady and deep. "You didn't have to come here, General." Wyatt's eyes softened. "I did, because if I didn't, the truth would die quietly, and you've carried enough silence for one lifetime." Daniel looked down for a second, then back at him. "We all did what we had to do," Wyatt nodded, "and you kept doing it long after everyone else stopped." The judge leaned forward, her voice quiet but strong. "This court has heard enough." She looked at Daniel. "Mr. Rigg, please stand." He did. The judge hesitated for a second, then spoke firmly. "In light of new testimony and the extraordinary context brought before this court, all charges are hereby dismissed, effective immediately." Her gavel came down softly, not in anger, but with finality. The sound was gentle, but it hit harder than any verdict ever could. The bailiff stepped forward, unhooked the last piece of chain from Daniel's belt, and backed away respectfully. This time no one saw a criminal. They saw something else, something they couldn't quite name but felt deeply. The courtroom remained silent as Daniel turned toward the jury. He nodded once. No words, no smile, just acknowledgement. Then he walked slowly down the aisle toward the exit, boots heavy but steady. Outside, the doors waited. So did the sunlight. Daniel Rigg stepped into the sunlight, his worn boots crunching softly on the courthouse steps. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of judgment lift from his shoulders. He didn't hurry. He didn't speak. He didn't wave to the reporters crowding the sidewalk. He didn't need to. Outside, a small group of veterans had gathered. They had arrived quietly, unannounced, to show respect. One man saluted without being asked. Another just nodded, eyes misty. Daniel acknowledged them with a simple tilt of his head. No ceremony, no applause, just recognition, the kind that mattered. Reporters called out, trying to get a word, a reaction, anything that could fit into a headline. But Daniel ignored them all. Words had never been his way to communicate. He had carried stories, memories, and sacrifices silently for decades. Today was no different, except this time, someone had spoken for him. Behind him, General Wyatt followed, not as an escort but as a witness. The sun glinted off the stars on his shoulders, but he didn't shine with pride. He walked quietly, matching Daniel's measured pace. His presence was a shield and a testament, a reminder that someone remembered, that someone understood. As they reached the edge of the parking lot, Daniel paused for a moment. He looked at the surrounding town, the quiet streets, the small shops, the faded library, and felt the strange mixture of peace and alienation he had always carried. This world moved slowly. People forgot quickly, but for once, the world had paused just long enough to see him clearly. Wyatt cleared his throat softly. "You know, Daniel, they'll write about today. They'll talk about it for weeks, maybe months." Daniel didn't reply. He just tilted his head, listening. "And the truth?" Wyatt continued. "They might never fully understand it, but you'll know. And that's enough." Daniel finally allowed a small, almost imperceptible nod. He had never asked for recognition. He had never sought praise. All he had ever wanted was to do the right thing, to survive, to protect others, quietly, without fanfare. And now, for the first time, someone had made sure the world remembered. The general glanced at him again, a hint of a smile breaking through his stern demeanor. "We did what we could," he said softly. Daniel lifted his eyes to the horizon. He thought of the war, the chaos, the silence he had carried, and the long years of being misunderstood. He thought of every life he had saved and every time no one had noticed. And yet there was no bitterness, no anger, only the quiet satisfaction of having done what was necessary. They walked together toward the edge of the town, shadows stretching long in the late afternoon sun. Around them, life continued. Children played on sidewalks, Cars drove by, and strangers walked past without knowing the depth of what had just passed through their streets. Daniel Rigg didn't need medals, ceremonies, or applause. Sometimes, a hero didn't wear a uniform anymore. Sometimes a hero simply walked through a courtroom with calm eyes and worn boots, carrying decades of honor and silence. And today, for the first time, someone had made sure that silence was heard. For a moment, Daniel allowed himself to feel a rare lightness. The world had paused, just enough. And in that pause, Daniel Rigg didn't leave as a criminal, nor as a hero. He left as a man who had always been exactly who he was, unchanged, unshaken, and quietly remembered. The veterans watched him go, the sun glinting on their own faded metals. Wyatt followed, knowing the world would forget soon enough. But that didn't matter. For now the story had been told, and the man who had carried it alone for decades finally had someone speak on his behalf. Sometimes greatness didn't need applause. It just needed recognition. And today, Daniel Rigg had received it.